So yeah, I am really going to focus on the basics of color science here. I'm going to try not to get too technical. I'm probably going to let a couple technical terms slip out, but if you don't understand it, you can just let that slip by, and yeah, Google it later. There's lots of great resources out there. So let's start with what is color. So color is basically the tiny piece of the electromagnetic spectrum that our eyes are sensitive to. So there's a range of wavelengths that we call color, from purple through blue, green, yellow, and red. The longer wavelengths are red, the shorter wavelengths are purple. So when we see an object like a red apple, it's reflecting more of those long red wavelengths, so we see that as red. And a green apple, it's reflecting more of the green wavelengths, so we see that as green. Now, our eye actually doesn't see the full spectrum of color in a continuous way. We actually have three little cells in our eyes called cones, three types of cells, that are sensitive to red, green, and blue. Color scientists talk about this as long, medium, and short sensors, because they're the long wavelength of light, the medium wavelength of light, of the short wavelength of light, but we can just call it red, green, and blue. And that's why when you're typically dealing with color in a digital world, you're dealing with three colors, because we're able to reproduce all the colors we can see with the three-color system by matching it up to the three sensitivities of our eyes. So a camera works in much the same way. It has a color filter over it to make it sensitive to red, green, and blue light, just like our eye is sensitive to that light. But if you'll notice from this spectral graph down here, the sensitivity of our eyes is not the same as the sensitivities of a camera. This is an actual CCD camera, red, green, and blue sensitivity. And this is where the color science comes in, is we can use math to apply transforms to make sure that even though it's actually not physically possible to create a sensor for a camera that exactly matches the way our eye sees the world, using some clever math, we can make it so that it reproduces images the way we see them. And in fact, of course, to do that for video and for film, it's not just about the camera, it's also about the display device. So you have a display device capable of reproducing a certain range of colors, again, usually a specific blue that it gives out, a specific green, and a specific red. And this is where color scientists earn their bucks, is by making sure that this whole system works and you're able to faithfully reproduce color. So the real breakthrough in this area came back in 1931 when the CIE, which was a bunch of guys in France, got together and came up with the XYZ color space. And this is three numbers, X, Y, and Z, that can represent all the colors that the human eye can see. And most importantly, if you measure two objects and they have the same XYZ values, you'll know they'll appear the same to the human eye, even if the spectral output isn't the same. Because we only have those three sensitivities, you can have like a very, very intense blue color that actually hits our eye the same way as a not intense blue color mixed with some other colors. And as long as we measure that and get the same XYZ values, we know that that people will see them the same way, so we can actually not worry about the fact that we're not matching the spectral distribution exactly. So if you look at the XYZ curves at the top, you'll see we have yet another curve which doesn't match with the sensitivities of the human eyes. And there's a key reason for that, is because this green curve actually matches our perception of luminance so that it can be kept separate from the color part of it. So the Y in XYZ is our perception of kind of brightness, or what we call luminance in color science speak. And that's this curve here. And if you look at this curve, it really peaks around these greenish yellow area and then goes back down at the ends. And it actually turns out that our perception of brightness is most influenced by green. If you look at a green square, a red square, and a blue square all right next to each other, these are giving off the same amount of light, the same intensity of light, but the green kind of appears brighter to us. And that's because the human eye's sensitivity to luminance is most sensitive to green. And this is exploited a lot of ways in video imaging, especially when you start doing compression and look at, like, what bits of information can I give away. It's important to know that luminance is a very important part of how we see images, and green is a very important part of that. So if I look at, this is why black and white photography works, is because luminance is so important to our human perception that even if you strip all the color out of the image, you can still see this is a tree, it has some nice composition. Whereas if I give you just the color of the image and don't show you any of the luminance information, none of the contrast, it doesn't look so great. Yeah, I can sort of tell this is a tree, but I certainly wouldn't want to watch a movie that looks like this, whereas I'd be quite happy to watch a black and white movie. And of course, when I put them together, that's when you kind of get the best results and get some real magic happening. But it's clearly the color that's accenting the tonality, the luminance, and the contrast underneath. It's not the color that's the primary driver. So that's another important thing for us color scientists to keep in mind, is even when we're dealing with all this color stuff, it's often the tonality, where stuff falls off into shadows and where the highlights are, and whether they're bright colors or dark colors. That's often just as important or even more important. But that said, the other nice thing that the XYZ color space gives us is this little graph called a CIE diagram, which basically plots all the colors that the human eye can see. So you got your full range of color. On the outside here are the pure spectral light, so pure green, pure red down here. And in the middle is how all those colors can be mixed together. So if you really want to look at, a full color space, you need a three-dimensional diagram, because going into and out of the screen is your luminance, your brightness. But it's quite handy to look at this flat CIE diagram just to look at the range of color that, say, a particular display device can reproduce. So if we plot a point on this CIE diagram and then plot another point, so say I have this green light source here and this red light source down here, the line that connects them will represent all the colors I can get by mixing those two light sources. So if I know exactly what the CIE XYZ values are for my green and what they are for my red, I can predict exactly what kind of orange, what kind of yellow, what kind of green I'm going to get by mixing those colors. And so if I have a three-color display device, as all TVs and digital projectors and stuff like that are, I get this triangle, which is the color gamut of the display device. So with the given blue, red, and green primary, inside this triangle are all the colors that particular display device can reproduce. Notice that you can't actually draw a triangle inside of this, funny kind of horseshoe-shaped diagram that encompasses all the colors that the human eye can see. So even though we're using three-color systems to record and display all our images, there's no three-color system that can actually represent the full gamut of human vision. And if you look at these spectral diagrams again, you can kind of see why, is that the cone that's responsible for our green sensitivity is actually always getting some kind of red exposure and or blue exposure with it. You're never getting just green, which is why it kind of has this funny roll off here rather than being a straight line, is that it's always mixed with other colors. So you can't go outside this diagram. There's no such thing as colors outside of this diagram. So to stay in it with a real-world three-color device, you're always going to have some subset of the range of colors that you could actually see. It turns out that's not such a big deal, though, because most of the colors on the outside of this diagram are colors that don't really exist in nature. Like you might get an extreme green like this off of a laser pointer with that's very, very calibrated to a narrow wavelength. But you're not going to get it, in typical lighting situations reflecting off an object or anything like that. And actually, this triangle that I've drawn here is the standard color gamut for an HD monitor, or what we call a Rec 709 monitor, because the SMPTE recommendation that described how to display HD video is called Rec 709. It's also the same color gamut used by computer monitors, which is called the sRGB gamut. So if you see, there's quite a significant amount of colors here, particularly in the greens and the cyans, but also a little bit in the purples and stuff like that you cannot reproduce on a Rec 709 monitor. And even when I go to the larger color gamut of digital cinema, what's called the minimum reference gamut anyway for digital cinema, which is called P3, which is this green triangle, yes, it can produce more colors, but it's still not reproducing a lot of this. But as I said, the images on a HD monitor, on a digital projector, look pretty good, and we're pretty happy with them, because these intense colors don't really exist that much in real-world situations. So it's, unfortunately, even though it's easy to draw the gamut of a display device on this diagram, it's a little bit harder to draw the gamut of a camera on this diagram. So it's hard to compare the color gamuts of cameras, because again, they have these overlapping sensitivities, where you're not always just getting the green sensor, you're always getting some blue or red mixed in with it. So that makes it very hard to plot the sensitivities of a camera. And even if you did put it on here, it would be kind of a funny horseshoe shaped, probably like the CIE diagram itself. It doesn't mean that if you get this intense green light that the camera wouldn't see it, it just means that it isn't able to differentiate between some of these really extreme colors. So if colors up here were outside of the gamut, they would all look more or less the same green, as opposed to if you did have a camera that was able to really reproduce this full gamut, you'd get color differentiation no matter what the color is. Now the problem does come with a lot of cameras that will take their native sensitivities, whatever whatever range of light that the camera can differentiate between, and then apply a color transform to fit it into that Rec 709 window for HD viewing. And when you kind of scrunch that color gamut into this 709 triangle, you are then giving up even more color separation. So you're losing some information when you go down and fit stuff down into that triangle. And this made sense when you think about it historically. Like in the early days of television, you had one camera, which is very, very expensive, and you wanted to feed that to millions of television sets that you wanted to sell as cheaply as possible, so everyone had one or two or three in their homes. So it made sense to put all the color salience into the camera itself, make that image look really good when you sent it right out to a monitor, so that the monitors didn't need to have any complex color science, and you could make your whole broadcasting system as streamlined as possible. But then people wanted to introduce this pesky notion of color correction. So people aren't necessarily happy just recording the colors that are in the world and reproducing them faithfully. They want to do some color matching to make sure that even though the light was changing over the course of their shoot, it looks consistent, or creatively to push the looks in different directions to make it feel cooler, or to make it feel warmer, or to just make it feel more exciting or more stunning. So if you put color correction into the mix, if you've already scrunched your images down into this Rec 709 triangle, then you've already given up a lot of color separation. And sure, you can still color correct it. There's things you can still do with it. But you've lost the ability to differentiate between a lot of these colors that you might want to do to, say, make your greens punchier or make your blues punchier. If you've already scrunched stuff down into this HD triangle, then you're not going to be able to get good color separation. And that's why it's so valuable on a lot of today's professional and prosumer cameras, that you have these raw modes of recording, or these wide gamut, or there's proprietary names for like S gamut for the Sony cameras, that really retain as much of the color range and color separation as possible, so that when you're in color correction, you decide for yourself how you want to scrunch stuff down to this 709 triangle. You don't have the camera make that decision for you up front. Now, going back to the issue of luminance, which, as I said, was very important, it's important to know that all electronic cameras, whether they have a CCD sensor in them or a CMOS sensor, record light linearly, meaning that as you increase the amount of light hitting the sensor, the numbers that the camera records go up in lockstep. So if you double the amount of light you're putting into a camera, you double the number that's coming off the CCD or the CMOS sensor. So it's a very straightforward relationship. And in physics, when we measure light, we measure it linearly typically as well. You can kind of think it as counting photons. For the more photons, the more little pieces of light that hit the camera, the higher the number gets. The problem is that our perception of luminance is not linear. Our perception actually looks a bit like this graph, where we're very sensitive to changes in shadows, and then as an image gets brighter and brighter and brighter, we're less and less sensitive to it. So if you do a small change in the shadows, we might notice it, but if you do a small change to the level of your highlights, we may not even notice it. You need a much bigger change before it becomes noticeable. And this works at all light levels, whether you're looking at the stars at night, or in a darkened room, or out under the bright sun. You're always going to be more sensitive to changes that are darker and going on in the shadows than you are to things in the highlights. This, by the way, is also where we get 80% gray cards from, because 80% gray cards are supposed to be halfway between black and white. So why don't we call it a 50% gray card? Well, we perceive that as 50% gray, but it's actually reflecting only 18% of the light. Because we're more sensitive to shadow areas, 80% reflectance, 80% gray card is actually halfway between black and white. So we have this issue where the sensors are all recording information linearly, but we have our perceived lumens rolling off quite quickly. So here I have a diagram with just 8 stops of range, which is actually a lot less than a lot of cameras do these days. And you can see the linear numbers are getting really quite big, whereas the numbers for kind of what we actually perceive as changes are staying relatively small. And if I went out to the 10 or 12 stops that a camera can do, this relationship becomes super extreme. This linear just shoots up, 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 and the perceived luminance becomes almost a flat line on the bottom of the graph. And that's a problem because storing big numbers means using more computer memory. So it means that the files you're recording on your camera are going to be a lot bigger. It takes a lot more time to transfer them around. And so let's talk a little bit about bit depth. A bit is the basic storage unit for a computer. So you'll hear about cameras recording, 8 bits or 10 bits or 14 bits or 16 bits. At its basic fundamental level, 1 bit just means a 0 or 1, on or off. So if you have a 1-bit image, every pixel is either going to be completely black or completely white. Every time you add a bit, you double the number of colors that you can encode. So for 2 bits, you can actually record 4 levels. For 3 bits, you can record 8 levels. When you get up to 8-bit, you're talking about 256 levels. And this is actually 8 bits per channel. So there's 256 gradations of red, 256 gradations of green, 256 of blue, and those all combine into gray. And you can go up to 10 bits, which is 1024 levels, or all the way up to 16 bits, which is over 65,000 levels of differentiation. But when you get up to 16 bits, you're talking about a lot more storage now, and again, more space on your hard drive, longer time to transfer files, and all that. So what we do for displays, most people probably know that 8-bit is kind of the gold standard for distribution, at least to the home and to your iPad and to computers and everything else. Sometimes even laptop computers will do less than 8-bit, and we don't really notice it. We don't see, unless you look very carefully, you don't see any stepping or anything like that. If we tried to encode linear as 8-bit, we would. That would be a problem. So it's not just the number of bits you use to store a number, it's actually how you use them. So what we typically do for display is we apply what's called a gamma curve, which is a very simple function, and it's somewhere in the range of a power function to 2.2 to 2.6 gamma, 2.4 being the average and being the standard now for display of HD video. So if I just get rid of the linear line here on this graph, you can see that a 2.4 gamma curve actually matches up pretty well to what the actual human perception is. So all display devices out there expect images to be sent to them with some kind of gamma correction, as I said, in the range of 2.2, which is typically used for computer monitors, 2.4 for HD monitors, or 2.6 for digital cinema. So it's all kind of dancing around this line of perceived luminance. So that's how you're able to more efficiently use the bits to match up to what the human eye sees and not spend a lot of bits on the linear side of things. And I do just have to point out here, my own little pet peeve is a lot of people do talk about linear when they really mean video gamma. So you hear people talk about, oh, I got this log footage, I need to linearize it. What they're actually saying is they need to put it in video gamma, because linear is, again, a direct relationship between the amount of light you put in and the number you get out of it. So VFX people do work with linear because there's a lot of compositing operations and things like that make sense to do in a linear color space. But typically for video or even for digital cinema, you're working in some kind of gamma corrected space. So when you're linearizing it, you're actually gamma correcting it. There is also, of course, log curves, which a lot of cameras used, and in a normalized graph like this, you can see the log curve matches the human perception pretty closely as well. So it's the same thing, using the bits more efficiently to encode luminance and color the way we see it, rather than wasting bits on encoding those really big numbers, all the steps between those really big numbers that we can't even perceive. But the one problem with simple gamma correction is that it is meant for monitors, which have a very narrow range of tones that they're able to reproduce. A good monitor or display device can give you about 5 to 7 stops of range that it can display, whereas a camera can record, a high-end camera can record 9 to 13 stops of range, and the human eye can record even more than that. We say it's sensitive from about 10 to 20 stops. If you look at any one image or anything in real life just for a second, you're seeing roughly 9 to 10 stops of range. But the thing is that the eye can very quickly move around and look at different parts of the scene, and also open and close your iris quickly without you noticing it. So you may look at the shadows under your desk and see the detail under there, and then look right out the window at the sun and see stuff out there. And even though your eye can only see about 10 stops worth of information at once, so you couldn't really look under your desk and out the window simultaneously and see all that detail. because your eye can quickly move back and forth and open and close the iris, you can actually see about 20 stops just when you're looking around the room. But so we won't worry about trying to capture everything the human can see in that situation. We don't have a camera yet which can record 20 stops. But we do have these cameras that can record, 12, 13 stops, sometimes a little more, depending on who you talk to. And we have to crunch it down into this display device that can only do 5 to 7 stops. And if we just supply a basic 2.4 gamma curve and just take a 7-stop chunk out of it, we're not going to get a very pleasing image in many cases. So here's an image that is properly gamma corrected for video, and you can see that on my chart here, the whites are white and the blacks are black, and I got tonality in between. So for this part of the image where it's properly lit, it looks pretty good. But if you look in the background here, there's a lot more light back here, and this is all getting blown out. And of course, if you look at the windows, there's all sorts of detail here that if I were actually standing here looking at this scene, I would see detail out those windows. I also got all these specular highlights of the glass that are really kind of blinding, and all the practicals, all the details washed out of them. So just doing a simple, take the 7-stop range out of the camera that I want and chuck it onto a video monitor gamma corrected is not really going to give you a pleasing image. And in fact, this scene was recorded with a camera that shoots log, and here's the log image, and you can see all that detail is there. So the camera is able to see all the detail out the window and in the background here. It's just that we're not bringing it into the video monitor's range of what it can reproduce in a good way. So this is where color correction comes in, because you can decide how much of that highlight detail you want to keep. It may be that if you have a scene which didn't have these windows, if it was just a close-up on her, it may not matter, because you don't need all that extra range. You just need the 5 to 7 stops to represent her face. But if you've got one that has a wide range of tones like this, then yeah, you want to do some color correction to determine how to bring that information in. So here again is the image with just a straight 5 to 7 stop chunk out of it, and here it is just doing a very simple highlight roll-off in the color corrector before I apply that 2.4 gamma curve. So again, that's without color correction, with all the blown out highlights, and you see the specular detail and the practicals here. And if I just do a simple highlight roll off, I get some detail back. My highlights aren't blowing out so as much, and it all looks much more natural and nice. The problem, of course, with log recording or raw recording is that when you look at the flat image on set, or when you first bring it into editorial, if you haven't color corrected, or into the color correction bay, it looks pretty flat and ugly and desaturated. And that's because if you take this wide range of color and this wide range of contrast that a camera can capture and just stuff it onto your screen, which can only represent a small amount of that range, it's going to look flat and desaturated. So that's when you would want to use a color transform like I did. In this case, that was just a simple 2.4 gamma curve with color correction in front of it to determine how you want to feed into that gamma curve. So what I don't recommend is just taking this flat log image and starting to color correct it and trying to make it look good, because you're going to spend a lot of time just making the image look decent, which robs you from your time of being able to do the creative color correction that you want to do to really finesse the image, or draw the eye where it needs to be drawn, or put the emotional power into it. So if you can have a color transform that already gets you 80 or 90% of the way to where you want to be, it makes a lot of sense to do that. You just want to make sure that you're using the transform after your color correction, not before, because if you do it before you color correct in your pipeline, then you're grading on top of the LUT. You've kind of already given up a lot of decision-making power as to how those colors and how that tonality is brought into the range. If you color grade before that LUT or before that transform, then you have a lot more flexibility to choose how you want to bring those colors into this limited range. You get a much better result much faster. So if you have your one camera and you have your one display device and you have a transform, and a lot of the camera manufacturers, whether it's Sony or Arri or Red, provide these transforms for you, then you're pretty much set. But unfortunately, a lot of productions today have to deal with this situation, which is you have a project that's shot on a number of different cameras. You got that stuff shot on the GoPro, that stuff shot on the iPhone. They shot a little bit on the F55 or some other small Sony camera, and some on the Alexa, and they have to mix it all into this final piece. And oh, by the way, you're not just delivering to HD video, you're also delivering to digital cinema and to film, and there's a 3D version which has its own color requirements, and you just have all this stuff coming in, and you need to give it out to all these places. And you could try to track color transforms and LUTs that deal with all the different combinations of these devices, but I certainly wouldn't recommend it. The better thing is to have a color system, a color management system, which can deal with that. And I'm not going to go too much into detail about the different systems that are out there and certainly specific software products and stuff like that. I do just want to mention that there is a movement in the industry to standardize a color management system that deals with that, and that's called ACES, the Academy Color Encoding System, which is developed by the Academy of Motion Pictures, Arts, and Sciences. And they've been working on this for another years. I'm on the committee that's helping develop it. And it's not quite finished yet, but it is out there and it is being used, and it does a lot of great things. So the trick that ACES does is, remember how I said that there's no triangle you can put on this CIE diagram with real-world colors that that would encompass the entire range of human vision? Well, ACES says, well, we'll just make imaginary colors then, and actually make this big triangle outside the CIE diagram to be able to represent all the colors that are inside of it. So there are a range of values in ACES that are invalid, that don't actually map to any real-world color. But the nice thing is that this kind of future-proofs the system and makes it so that it can encode any color from any camera, even cameras developed in the future, which may have better color response than the cameras now, and be able to support any display device. Again, laser projectors, things like that, which may get a much wider color gamut than devices today can get. So the foundation of ACES is this color space that allows you to work and do your color correction and not be limited by any particular camera or by any particular display device. So ACES also provides transforms for every camera and transforms for every display device. The ones for the cameras are called IDTs, or input device transforms. So these are often provided by the camera manufacturer or developed by the Academy in association with the camera manufacturer to dictate how to get their raw or wide gamut log images into ACES color space. And then you also have ODTs for a variety of display devices. ODTs are the output device transform, which tell you how to get to all your different display devices. So as I said, ACES isn't officially released as a full spec yet. We've certainly been field testing it for a long time, used it on a number of projects. The first project I used it on in the real world, so to speak, was about 2.5 years ago now for a restoration project. There's a number of feature films finished this year that have used ACES, including Elysium, which is out in theaters now. They used a full ACES color workflow for all the coloring in the DI, but also all the VFX. So it's definitely usable. I definitely recommend checking out. And most importantly, all the camera manufacturers support it to some degree or another. And a lot of the color tools, whether it's Baselight or other color correctors, are on board with supporting ACES as well. So hopefully this will be the future foundation that kind of helps you manage a lot of this stuff. And if you're feeling a little bit adventurous, it is out there now, and you can start using it now. The one kind of caveat with all these kind of color transforms is that it's based on all very good science and based on very good physics and an understanding of how we see light. But it's color science is all, and any science really, is all just a collection of theories. And there's a quote I like that the difference between theory and reality is that in theory they're the same thing, but in reality they're a little different. So we've talked about how the eye sees color, and we understand very well how the cones work and process it, but there's this pesky thing called the brain, which we don't have a full understanding of, that processes the images and actually recognizes things and triggers memories and does all this other stuff that's it's hard to map with a mathematical equation. And I have some fun slides here that kind of show you how some of this works. So as most of you probably know, our brain and our eyes do a kind of automatic white balancing, so that if you go outside on a sunny day with a blue sky, things look relatively normal and even tonality. There's no kind of crazy color cast. And if you go inside and are under incandescent lighting, the same thing. Everything kind of looks normal. There's no particular color cast. But if you do the same thing with a camera, the outside is, if you don't tell it the outside is daylight, things will look very blue. If you don't tell it the inside is tungsten, things will look very red. And that's because cameras don't have an automatic color balance like our brains do. So you need to tell a camera what color temperature you are shooting under. So this is an example of an image that was a tungsten white balanced, but obviously a daylight image out at the beach. But if you look, I mean, you can still see that clearly the raft that this woman is holding is yellow. She's got a red bathing suit. You know, that's blue sky, all that. So we know something's a little bit off. We know this image is too cool, but we can still recognize all the colors and recognize the image, and all that's fine. And if I put an 85 filter in front of this to balance it for tungsten, yeah, that looks better. But you know, all the colors are more or less fundamentally the same. Now, if I take that color filtration and apply it to everything except the yellow raft, so if I leave the yellow raft basically tungsten balanced and the rest of the image daylight balanced, it looks like this. And now it looks like she's holding a lime green raft, not a yellow raft. But in fact, it's exactly the same color that's coming out of the screen and coming to your eye between these two images. So if you look at the raft as I toggle between these two images, you'll see that the color of the raft itself is actually not changing. If you look at the actual pixel values that this picture is putting out, you'll see that the pixel values are identical. If you used a light probe to measure the actual light coming out of the screen, you'd see that the light coming out of the screen is identical. But in the first image, we see it as a lime green raft, and in this one, you see it as a yellow raft. And in fact, if I put these images side by side, again, on the left-hand side here, this color is the exact same value as this color. If you had a probe and measure the XYZ values, you'd find that they're exactly the same. But because our brain doesn't look at colors and objects in isolation, we're always comparing them to the objects around them. We see that, oh, okay, this is a daylight balanced scene, so that's a lime green thing she's holding. Whereas if we know the color temperature is off, our mind automatically adjusts and says, oh, that's actually something yellow that she's holding. And the same thing works if you go the other way. Again, this raft and this raft are the exact same color, technically speaking. The XYZ values are the same. It's the same amount of light hitting your eye, but we perceive them differently because the colors around them are different. So here's another example of obviously a digitally produced diagram, but you see there's these two squares, A and B is clearly the brighter square. But actually, the true intensity, the amount of light coming off this B and A square are the same. And if I kind of break the illusion here by drawing a connection between them, you can see, in fact, that they're the same color value. But when you see them without that break in between there, clearly B looks brighter and A looks darker. And that's because our brain sees that B is in shadow, but because the same amount of light is hitting our eye, it automatically makes our kind of image processing think that, oh, that's a brighter square down there. And this works for color as well. If I put an orange dot down here, the orange dot in shadow looks brighter than the orange dot that's not in shadow, but in fact it's the actual same amount of light that's hitting your eye. So surrounding is very important to how you perceive color and how you perceive tonality. Here's another image that you could probably guess what's going to happen. We have a gray square on top, a white square on the bottom here, but the actual color value of the center of the gray square and the center of the white square are the same. And why do we see one is gray and one is white? Well, that's because, again, we don't perceive individual pixels of color. We see objects. We know this is a white object and this is a gray object and perceive it accordingly. Here's another fun one. So I have two gray squares up here with a little bit of ramping going on in the middle here. But basically, you'll see that the square on the left is darker than the square on the right. But in fact, that's not the case. Again, this square is putting out the exact same amount of light as this square on the right. And if I cover up what's happening in the middle, you can see that, yes, these are the same color value. So go back, and if you want, you can hold your finger up or just cover up what's going on in the middle of the screen, and you'll see that when you cover it up, the two squares are the same, but when your eye sees what's going on in the middle, they look different. So what's actually going on here is that I have a color here, and then a quick ramp, and then it jumps up brighter and back down to the same level again. But our brain has some sharpening in it and some imaging processing in it to help us, more clearly kind of see objects and see the outlines of objects. And I basically tripped it up by doing this ramp here, and it's exaggerated the difference with its kind of internal sharpening algorithm, so it sees the one on the left as clearly darker than the one on the right, even though, again, it's the exact same amount of light coming out of them. And this is actually important if you're ever comparing images side by side. Certainly in the early days of DI, and even still some today, we would often compare digitally projected image to a film projected image simultaneously to make sure that the digital deliverable and the film deliverable were the same. But you would get this overlap between the two projectors, which sometimes had some color fringing to it. So here I've simulated it. We have a little bit of magenta shading on the left here and a little bit of yellow shading on the right, so it makes this whole image look a little bit pinker and this whole image look a little bit yellow, where if I block out what's going on in the middle there without changing any of the color values, you see they're actually identical, but that color fringing makes the color of the two images look different. So that's something to look out for. So one more fun one here. If you stare at the black dot in the middle of the screen, try not to move your eyes or your head. You can blink if you need to and all that, that's fine, but just stare at that center black dot, and I'm going to change the image out from under you, and then you can move your eyes once I've changed the image. And I'll do that one more time. What you should see, again, if you stare at the black dot without looking at your eyes, kind of let your eyes adjust to that image, just focus on the black dot in the middle of the image. And then after the image has changed for a second, you can move your eyes. What you should see is a color image kind of superimposed on the black and white image, and as soon as you move your eyes, that is broken, because what's happening when you're staring at this image is the color balancing of your eye and your mind is already going to affect, is already dialing down the colors that are so intense on that image. So when you see the next image, it continues to have that dialed down, and makes it look like a color image, even though it's black and white. So this is similar to kind of an effect you'll get by wearing like sea goggles or tinted glasses, where, you know, if they're yellow tinted glasses, when you first put them on, the world looks a little bit yellow, but then quite soon everything will look fine, and then when you take them off, you know, the world will suddenly look pink or suddenly look purple. And that's because of that automatic white balance thing that's going on. And this is important in the color suite too, because if you start grading an image really, really blue, and you say, oh man, I just want it really blue and really dark, and you're, you know, sitting in your color session for an hour and pushing it bluer and darker, then you'll go back to another scene that has a more normal tonality, and you'll see how dramatic the difference is, because your eye has been adjusting to how blue and dark the image is, and you keep pushing it further and further to make it bluer and darker. So that's a trap that's easy to fall into. And that's part of why colorists utilize scopes like the waveform monitor or parade monitor and the vector scope, is because that gives them an unbiased view of kind of where they are in the range of color on the vector scope, or where they are in tonality on the parade monitor. So it kind of is an impartial third party that can help keep you grounded as far as where the color is going. And it can also help, particularly if you're in a dark grading room all day, to either look at some other images you're familiar with that aren't related to the film, or jump between different sequences of the film, just so you're not spending too much time color correcting one thing, getting too used to that color, because of course the audience is only going to see that scene for a minute or two, and they're not going to adapt to it to the same amount of time that you are if you're going on and grading for a half an hour, an hour. These things, as I said, don't translate well into, you know, formulas and mathematics that we can account for. It's really just stuff you have to be aware of, and it's on set as well. You have to be aware of how your eyes adapt to the environment, because if you're, you know, shooting outside and then you duck your head under a tent to look at a monitor, your eye is going to see something very different than if you were actually under that tent for 10 or 15 minutes and your eyes adjusted to the darker surround, like you would be when you actually do the final color correction, you know, or watch the final piece at home or in the theater. So you have to know you can't trust your eyes too much if you're out in the sunlight, ducking your head into the tent to look at a monitor and then ducking back out. So if you want to really check exposure or want to check how much shadow detail you have, you either have to sit in that tent for a little while to let your eyes adjust, or better yet, rather than make the producer furious that you're waiting around, standing around holding a production waiting for eyes to adjust, use the waveform monitor and look at how much detail you have there, and trust that, okay, if you see the detail there, you're going to have the room you need to manipulate it in post-production. But as I said, color transforms are still extremely valuable. Even though they can't account these things, they can still do the vast majority of the heavy lifting for you, so that you can just focus on the creative part. And most color transforms are applied in the form of lookup tables, and we're really in the era of the lookup table, I think. When I got started at Kodak, what was it, 13 or 14 years ago now, you know, 3D lookup tables was this crazy esoteric thing that almost no one knew how to use, and now pretty much any piece of software supported it. So let's just talk a little bit about what a lookup table is, because you're seeing them everywhere now. So the most simplest form of lookup table, or LUT, is a 1D lookup table. And that just means that it's only accounting for one color channel at a time. So lookup table is basically just saying for a certain value you give me in, actually give me a slightly different value out. So you can think of it as kind of a curve. So a lookup table which does nothing would be a straight line, meaning that for whatever value you put into it, give me the same value out of it. Something with a curve like this says, depending on what comes in, if it's if it's a darker number, change it more drastically. If it's a lighter number, don't change it so drastically. So I can apply kind of a contrast curve or a color curve. And 1D lookup tables are actually three 1D lookup tables. There's a lookup table for red, one for green, and one for blue. And with those, you can represent all kinds of contrast changes and tonality changes. The problem comes if, say, you just want to make your reds a little bit brighter. Well, that should be easy enough, right? You just change your red curve to make the reds brighter. The problem is that you're affecting anything that has red in it. So even though you just wanted to make your reds brighter, you're actually changing your oranges, you're changing your purples, you're changing your yellows, your browns, even your grays, because those all have a component of red to it. So 1D lookup table can't do specific color changes. It really does very overall tonality changes, which is why we came up with the 3D lookup table, which does look at each possible color value independently of each other. And the easiest way to think of a 3D lookup table is as kind of a cube of color. So I have blue on one axis, red on one, green on the third, and all the values in between can be made from mixing those colors. And again, I'm saying, okay, for a certain red, green, blue value out, certain red, green, blue value in, I want a certain red, green, blue value out. And you can very specifically, for just this range of red colors, I want to make them brighter and don't touch anything else, or just the whites, make them a little darker and don't touch anything else. You can also still do quite large global changes as well by moving all these points of the 3D LUT. And the first use of 3D LUTs in our industry was really for film emulation, for digital film work. And that kind of helps illustrate the difference between a 1D LUT and a 3D LUT. So you have these film scans, which are log film scans, and they come in very flat, just like the log recording on a digital camera. But what you really want to do is see what they're going to look like printed and projected in the theater. So you want what's called a print film emulation LUT that's going to simulate what this negative scan will look like once we record it back out to film and project it in a theater. So if I do that with a 1D LUT, I can actually do a pretty good job of getting the contrast right for what this image looks like when it's actually printed and projected. But the color isn't quite right because I can't change the individual color values in a 1D lookup table. So these colors are much more bright and saturated than they would actually be on film. Whereas a 3D LUT can do both the tonality and also get these colors right to match more accurately what a film is going to look like. So that allowed people to do very careful color work digitally, watching it through a 3D lookup table. But a 3D lookup table can actually represent any color transform, no matter how complex, as long as it's not doing any spatial processing, meaning you can't window someone's face or do a vignette and expect a 3D LUT to be able to recreate that. But the vast majority of color changes that we do are overall color changes. Now that could be saturation adjustments, it could be tonality and contrast adjustments, changing the highlights, changing the shadows, changing just the reds or the purples, making the reds oranger, whatever you want to do. All that kind of complex color correction can all be boiled down into one simple 3D lookup table. And color scientists really like them because they can do a lot of very complex math to basically simulate real-world things like how light reacts in a scene or how a film recorder works, and bake that all down to one simple 3D lookup table that any piece of software can apply. And the one thing to know about 3D lookup tables is that we don't actually represent every single possible color value because particularly for like a 10-bit system or more, if you tried to represent every single color value, you'd quickly run out of memory on the computer. So what we actually do is we have points that we use, and then we interpolate between those points when we apply the LUT, and actually have a kind of 3D representation here of a 3D LUT that I can show you. So if I rotate the cube around, you can see it has all these little points in the color space, evenly spaced. And this is kind of what the input values of the 3D lookup table look like. And if I swap to the output values, you can see they all change. And so that's basically where I'm pushing the color. By swapping between the input and the output, I could see where I'm pushing all the different color values on the LUT. So you can actually use You can actually use 3D LUTs and 1D LUTs in combination, and that's actually quite powerful to use the 1D LUT to kind of do the overall contrast adjustment, and then use the 3D LUT to just kind of clean up the colors. So we actually only need about 16 points on each axis in a 3D LUT, a 16 by 16 LUT, combined with the 1D shaper LUT to do the vast majority of color transforms that you're going to do. So some people will brag about how many points their LUTs have, but most of the time you don't need it unless you're doing very, very small color changes. Now, the other interesting thing is that a 3D lookup table can also be used to capture any color translation. So if you have some black box or some piece of software that you don't exactly know what it's doing to the image, but you like what it's doing to the image, you can actually capture that as a 3D LUT. So instead of putting your normal image through that black box or through that piece of software, you can put a special image which basically has all the points of the 3D LUT on it. And then if you have software like TrueLight or some other color management software, it can look at the points that come out of that black box and build a 3D lookup table which recreates that same effect. So if you have some piece of software that you get a certain look at, a certain look that you like out of, you can actually capture that as a 3D LUT and then put that in another piece of software. So this is done all the time, for instance, for VFX, where the colorist may set a very specific look, but of course they don't have that same color corrector at the VFX house, but they'll export it as a 3D lookup table, which represents all that color change, and then they can apply that in their compositing software and see what the color change is at the post house without having to have the color corrector. That does also mean, though, that a LUT is really just a set of assumptions. It's all based on a set of assumptions. So LUTs only work when you give them exactly what they expect coming into them, and have a certain set of assumptions for what they're going out on. So, for instance, a LUT for a camera will be very specific to that camera and that camera's color space, and also be specific to a display device. So you might have an ARRI LUT for a Rec. 709 monitor, or a red LUT for a digital projector. And if you try to use those LUTs outside of those very specific contexts which was assumed it would be used, then it's just simply not going to work. And likewise, you might find a color correction that works really well in one image, and you try to capture that and apply that as a 3D LUT on another image, and it doesn't work anymore because that image was different and the set of assumptions is different. So some people think there's a magical LUT fairy that can deliver, if you just delivers the perfect LUT, it'll work in all situations, but it doesn't really work that way. A LUT only works for a specific scenario, and if you change any of the variables in that scenario, if you change the camera, or even the way that camera's recording, if you change your display device, if you even change the lighting in the image, if you've just developed a 3D lookup table by looking at reference images, and it turns out all those reference images were day exteriors, and you go to apply that to a night scene, or even a day exterior with just a slightly different quality of light, you may find that LUT doesn't work anymore. So if there's one kind of key thing you could take away from this whole presentation, it's hopefully that you should test your color pipeline in advance. And I know sometimes that's a real pain to do, but it's really, really important. And most post houses are very amenable to this. If you could get them some kind of test images and test out your whole workflow, there's so many problems you can get ahead of in advance by knowing what your color workflow is going to be, and making sure it all works, and not just trusting what you see on a spec sheet. Because a lot of people do go out to shoot assuming it's all going to work out in post, and then they realize the LUT that they thought was magical isn't actually all that magical. And then just also make sure any kind of color correction you're doing on set matches up with what's being done in post, because if you have some guy just working with some software on set, you kind of quickly color correcting the image, but it doesn't bear any resemblance to the color pipeline in post, you have these kind of last second panics where what everyone has been looking at in the editing bay doesn't match what's in where they're going with the color for the final, and then everyone freaks out. Well, what's the look of our film? Is it what we saw in editorial? Is it what we're seeing in DI now? So if it is, particularly if it's a very look-driven show, a look-driven project, it's always good to have this conversation between on-set and post up front. So I hope you've enjoyed this. There's certainly a lot more to know about color science, but hopefully that's some interesting detail for you. There's more references on my company's website, which is filmlight.ltd.uk. We have some white papers there you can read up on, and some video information. You're also more than welcome to get in touch with me directly, peterp.filmlight@gmail.com. And we'll also be hosting something here at Moviola, a seminar on Baselight for Avid. So stay tuned for some information on that coming up in late September. about how to use the Baselight tool for Avid. I realized that poll we gave in the beginning was actually a bit of a trick question, because you can grade in Baselight and color grade on your NLE now, because we have Baselight for Avid and for Final Cut. But hope you enjoyed it, and I'll pass it back over to Mike.
Wow. All right. Thank you, Peter. That was, well, my head is exploding, I think, along with a lot of other viewers here. That was incredible information, a lot of information to absorb. So now we got a little bit of time for Q&A. Peter, there isn't a lot of questions, because I think well, number one, you answered so many of them, but there was a ton of information here that you gave us, and a lot to absorb. And I think one of the questions, I think this is from our producer Blair, who loves this sort of thing. He loves everything to do with color. He says, taking all this information that you've given us, how do we realistically apply it to, especially a lot of the viewers out there are one-man bands. They are indie filmmakers, and is there just an easy solution for us to just apply all this wonderful information that you have given us, from the camera that we choose to the lighting situations to everything that we now have to do ourselves?
Right. Yeah, well, I mean, it certainly is a lot of information. I, didn't absorb it all in one sitting.
Yeah, I don't think. Yeah.
But a lot of this stuff, you once you hit the third or fourth time, it finally clicks. So I would certainly encourage people to go out and look at other resources, like I said, on our website. There's even some good articles in Wikipedia and other places that talk about this stuff. And I think you just have to do it in little steps and focus on where you think you might be having the most problems or the most opportunity for problems. So as I said, testing is always a great thing. To focus on the workflow you're going to use for your next shoot, and test that whole workflow. Shoot a little something, put it in through your NLE, put it in through your color correction software, make sure everything's talking to each other, and make sure that all works. And then when you hit problems, you can go and research those problems, or reach out to other people who have done that same workflow, and kind of work through it. And a lot of what I've given you today is kind of the underpinnings to understand why things sometimes do go wrong, rather than sometimes 100% having the answer, because it's different for every production. So.
Yeah, there's a lot of pressure on all of us, and including yourselves as filmmakers, to know everything and to be able to do everything. And of course that's just not possible. I mean, you can be a master of maybe one or two things, but certainly not a master of all. One of our viewers here, Kim, she would like to know more about LUTs. Well, you gave us a lot of information about LUTs, and now she's a Final Cut color user, but she's going to switch over to Premiere with a new Sony F5 footage, and she wants to know what your opinion is of speed grade, assuming you know anything about speed grade.
Yeah, I haven't spent a lot of time with speed grade. I would certainly say when you're learning the fundamentals of color correction, it really doesn't matter what application you're on. Yeah. It could be Apple Color, could be speed grade, could be Resolve, could be Baselight. The basic fundamentals of colors are the same. Where most of these tools differentiate is when you really start picking an image apart and trying to track objects or do very careful color changes, or in those situations where you have more money than time, where you need to work really quickly. That's when a lot of these tools differentiate from each other. So the basic core color correction tools in all these software are actually quite similar. So yeah, I would say go for it and give speed grade a try. The one thing that I hope will come to these tools sooner rather than later is the ACES color management that I talked about.
Right.
Because that was
really interesting.
Yeah, that is certainly a big boost up if you already have kind of your basic, getting from the camera to something useful taken care of. If you get just kind of that one light, you put up the image, it looks good, it doesn't look flat and ugly, but you still have a lot of room to move it around. That's a great thing, and I know the Academy's working with a lot of software vendors to implement this stuff as quickly as possible.
Everything is changing all the time. You talk about color science being a collection of theories. I mean, how much is it changing from is everything that you were saying today going to be obsolete in a couple of years?
Yeah, the core underlying science actually hasn't changed that much since 1931 when they came up with that XYZ color space. So they've actually gone back and kind of revisited that work, and they found out that a few small errors were made, but so much has been built on that work that was done in 1931. We kind of keep that foundation to color science, so that the basic understanding of how the eye works and all that is pretty much locked down. What is, of course, changing are the cameras themselves, and
Yeah.
the amount of dynamic range and the amount of color they can capture. So that's the key thing to just kind of keep up with, is to know that you will need some kind of a the wider the gamut and the wider the dynamic range, the more important it's going to be to have a good color transform, whether that's a lookup table or an ACES transform or something built into your color correction software to help you bring that into a useful space more quickly. Otherwise, you're going to spend a lot of time spinning the knobs just trying to get something useful out of it, which is time that could be better spent doing creative things.
Jarrett wants to know, do you have any book recommendations for newcomers looking to get into color grading or the study of colors in general?
Unfortunately, most of the book resources out there talk about color science for the print world. Which is very different than our world. Because
that was going to be my next question.
Because looking at a piece of paper under light, our eye and our brain actually do very different things than when you're sitting in a dark theater or a dark living room looking at an image. So there are very different challenges with that kind of printing press and graphic design work as opposed to what we do in our industry. And most of us have learned on the job, so there's not a lot of good research out there. As I said, there's a fair amount on the web you can read up on.
Yeah.
There's a book on digital cinema by Glenn Kennel that's pretty good if you want to know specifically about how the digital color works for digital cinema and digital projection. But yeah, no, maybe.
So this is where spending time with people like you in a classroom situation is really beneficial rather than a book.
Yeah, and I think, as you say, because it is all changing, that once you get to the actual applying this color science to your actual workflows, because the cameras are changing so much and the software changing so much, that is hard to keep up with. So I think part of why there isn't a book out there is that as soon as you publish it, if you're trying to give people really practical information, it will go out of date pretty quickly.
Pete asks, what is the largest color temperature range, i.e. 5,000 degrees, 5,400 degrees, that may be considered imperceptible to normal viewers?
It actually depends. So just to fill in people who may not be able to follow that. So color temperature is what I talked about with that white balance. So you have a tungsten color temperature where you have very warm light making everything very warm, and you have daylight color temperature where, because the sky is blue, everything looks very kind of blue, and there's this whole spectrum of ranges in between and actually way beyond to really, really intensely blue light or really, really intensely warm light. So that whole range of color temperature. And unfortunately, there's no one number you can use for how much of a difference in that color temperature is noticeable, because it's different depending on if it's much more towards the red end of the spectrum or much towards the light end of the spectrum. And in really controlled conditions, the human eye is actually quite good about picking up on differences to color temperatures. So if you do a side-by-side comparison between different color temperatures, you only need a couple of degrees Kelvin for the eye to pick it out. Now, single stimulus, if you put me in one room that's has an image that's being projected 5,600 Kelvin, and then you take me outside and down the street to another room where an image is projected at 6,000 Kelvin, I'm probably not going to be able to tell the difference. When I put them direct side by side, the difference will be glaring. But because my eye is adapting to those different rooms, it's not going to be as noticeable when you just look at them one-on-one.
Donnie asks, and I think you might have answered this, but it's good to bring it up again. What current color correction tools use the ACES specs?
So Baselight, of course, does. We've been, as I said, doing it for over 2.5 years now. And in fact, we have a Baselight 4.4 software coming up that actually integrates the ACES transforms.
Say that again.
The Baselight 4.4 software, version 4.4, is going to be released in a few weeks, and that integrates the ACES transforms more deeply into the software. But Resolve has ACES transforms in it already as well. And even if it's not built into the software, you can apply ACES transform just as 3D LUTs. So if you go to the Academy's website and do a search for ACES, there's a link to GitHub, which is a source code repository, but they actually put all the ACES color transfers in there, so it's all open and available to the public. So anyone could go down and download those transforms, and you could convert them into lookup tables for just about any piece of software, as long as it can apply both that input LUT and that output LUT. So as long as you can apply 2 LUTs and color grade in between, you're doing ACES.
We're getting a lot of Baselight questions because obviously a lot of people are not familiar with it. Johnny asks, so what is the advantage of Baselight for Final Cut Pro over, say, Resolve, which is what he uses?
Well, the big difference is that the color tools are integrated into the application, so you never actually have to leave Final Cut. You're working on the Final Cut timeline, but with the full set of color tools you would get in a standalone Baselight. So it's even more tightly integrated than even Apple Color, because you're never actually jumping out of the timeline. It's just an effect that's applied directly to each clip. But you can still do things like motion tracking shapes onto objects to color correct them, and all that.
Yeah, we had a brief conversation prior to this whole thing, and Baselight is actually a more full-featured set than Resolve, and Resolve is somewhat catching up with it. Is that
yeah, I think
is that fair to say?
I think so, yeah.
I mean, I know you work for Filmlight,
right,
but is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. And certainly, just the time it takes to export a project out of Final Cut into Resolve, and then if you have to do some finishing and titling back in Final Cut to get it back out of Resolve and into Final Cut, that's a whole workflow that's quite prone to errors and takes up a lot of time, just kind of doing grunt work of rendering files and moving them around. So if you can stay in your editing software and you're going to do all your deliveries right out of there, I think that alone saves you a lot of time and lets you do, just focus more on doing the creative color.
But where can I get more information about ACE's color space?
Yeah, so as I said, if you go to the Academy's website and do, which is I think oscars.org, or if you just Google ACES, a bunch of links will come up. As I say, GitHub is the repository of all the color transforms, and there's some README files in there. But if you work with a specific piece of software like Resolve or Baselight, you can also contact the manufacturer, or contact me if you're using Baselight, and I could point you to some of the basics of what you need to get started with it.
Steve asks, is CMOS better than CCD in terms of color capture?
No, you can't say unequivocally that one is better than the other. In fact, both CMOS sensors and CCD sensors in and of themselves don't actually see color. They only see, they can only basically, they see kind of a wide spectrum of light, often into infrared and ultraviolet and stuff that the human eye doesn't see. So what manufacturers do is they put filters in front of those CCDs or CMOS sensors to filter just the red, the green, or the blue light. So often those filters are quite similar between CCDs and CMOS sensors. The big advantage of a CMOS sensor is that it's economical to make a big sensor, so you get a nice a nice depth of field similar to what you would get with 35mm film, and that's very hard to do with CCDs because you need to get a really good color capture of CCDs. You need 3 of them: one for red, one for green, one for blue. So that makes the cameras pretty expensive pretty quickly, and that's why most stuff has switched over to CMOS technology.
Again, another Baselight just came in. Is it available for Final Cut 10? And the answer is no.
Nope.
But
yes, stay tuned.
Put in your feature requests, and Filmlight is a good company, and they do listen.
Yeah, no, it's certainly something we've looked at. We're keeping an eye on the development of Final Cut 10, and as more pro users adopt it, that's definitely something we'll look at doing.
Kim's question, I feel like the terminology can get confusing where color space and color gamut are used interchangeably, and one concept I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around is RGB as a signal versus YCBCR versus RGB as a color space, sRGB. Can you please elaborate a little on this, or am I just better off just...
No, it's
that's a good question.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. It is a confusing thing. That's because RGB it's kind of generic. That could be used to describe any color space that uses 3 primaries. So Digital Cinema P3 is an RGB color space. Rec 79 for video is an RGB color space. But basically, everything I talked about in my presentation is talking about things in terms of RGB, because that's the closest way to the way we see color. There is this thing, as she said, called YCBCR, which separates the luminance from the chrominance, and I did talk a little bit about that too. And the main reason for doing that is because we're so much more tuned in to differences in luminance. When you separate them, you can compress the chrominance information a lot, compress the color information a lot more, and actually throw a bunch of it away, and most people won't notice. So it's a way to keep file sizes down. So that's why you have YCBCR. It's purely just to make file sizes smaller and be able to discard information without it being too noticeable to people degrading the images. So pretty much all image processing is done in RGB because that's the way we see light, that's the way we measure light. And YCBCR is really just for more efficient ways of compressing and transporting images.
Okay, Pete asks, are there Are there color correction, color grading guidelines for optimizing the viewer experience for colorblind audience while minimizing degradation for normally sighted audience members? Obviously, this would be a niche thing, but
Well, as I said, the because the most important part of human vision is the luminance. If you're making something with really good tonality and all that,
yeah,
then it's not going to matter so much that they're colorblind because people live with being colorblind, and so they'll see the movie much like they see the world. Now, when people are colorblind, it's typically not that they don't see any color, it's just that they can't differentiate between certain colors. The most common form of colorblindness is red-green colorblind, meaning that people can't really differentiate very well between red colors and green colors.
right.
So if you're, the only thing I would say is that if you want to avoid that, make sure you're not doing anything which has where you want people attracted to, say, something red in the scene, but have it surrounded all by green that's of the same tonality. So if a very bright person in a bright red coat with bright green foliage around them, a colorblind person isn't going to be able to see that as well, I guess. But that type of situation is pretty rare.
Klaus asks, Scopes monitors are the main reference for our work. Most of them are still 8-bit. How can we cope with high-bit depth sources while we cannot actually see our material?
It actually shouldn't matter so much that the scope is only 8-bit, because a scope is really just kind of grabbing an overall summary of the image. And you really need to zoom in way into a scope to see the difference between 8 bits and 10 bits or higher. So if you're doing that really kind of very detailed work where you want to see when it's quantizing, then I would say you just have to go to a software scope, and hopefully your software has either a histogram or some kind of a waveform monitor built in that is full bit depth that you can zoom into. But for the vast majority of the work where you're just trying to make sure that you're staying within the range of tonalities that you want to stay in, that you're staying within, what's legal for broadcast, and you have a good black and a good white, you could even have a scope that's less than 8-bit and it wouldn't matter.
David's got a good question here, and I think we've brought it up a few times before when we had some color correction webinars. But he says, what is the optimal color for the walls of either an edit suite or a color grading suite? I mean, what colors should be? Mine, of course, is bright orange. Seriously, I got a bright orange room.
Well, that's a problem. I mean, as you saw with the slides I showed, our eye doesn't just look at one object all by itself. It's
right.
Constantly comparing to colors around it. So if you're doing color grading in a room with an orange background, you're automatically going to be biasing your images away from orange to kind of counteract that.
Even if I'm focused on the monitor, I can still get a little bit of that brain kind of...
Yeah, because unless you have an 80-inch monitor, it's probably not entirely filling your field of vision. So yeah, the wall should be gray. There is actually a SMPTE spec for how the level of illumination you should use and all that if you want to read it. But you'll actually probably be okay if you don't follow that to the letter. But yeah, you do want a neutral background. With some lighting that's around D65 in color temperature, because that's the white point color temperature for the monitor. So you want lighting that's around that same temperature illuminating the wall.
Jane asks, a recommendation for color software calibration tool for the monitor that you're looking at. Quite frankly, I'd get somebody to do it for you rather than do it yourself. But
yeah, the problem with most of the affordable, low-cost monitor calibration tools is that, again, they're designed for the print world. So they're all very focused on making sure that your white is properly calibrated and your bright colors are properly calibrated, and they kind of let the blacks fall where they may. Whereas in our industry, we're very focused on what's going on in the shadows. Shadow detail is very important. So if your inexpensive probe can't accurately measure the shadows, you don't know if you're getting a good monitor calibration or not. So yeah, there are high-end tools like TrueLight that are available for monitor calibration. But if the nice thing about modern LCDs and plasmas and the like is that they're very, very stable. So if you calibrate them once and you don't mess with the settings on the front of them, they're going to stay calibrated. Unlike CRTs, which constantly needed to be recalibrated because they would drift over time. So it is worth paying someone to come in or using some professional software to calibrate your monitor that once and then just keep it calibrated.
Is Baselight available for Premiere Pro, and is there a trial version that I can try out for 30 days or something like that?
Yeah, if you go to filmlightltd.uk, you can try out the trial version both for Avid and Final Cut. The next version we're actually working on for later this year is for Nuke. So the VFX vendors, VFX people can have a full color tool set as well. And then Premiere, the thing we're really waiting on is an EDL export that supports third-party plugins. Because one of the nice workflows with our plugin for Final Cut and Avid is you can export an EDL, which has all the color settings in it, into a full base light. So you can do some grading in your edit suite, finish it up in a proper grading suite on a base light, and they can actually, they don't even have to render, they can just export you a new EDL back that has all those color settings in it. Premiere doesn't have an EDL format which supports those third-party plugin settings, but hopefully they will soon, and then we'll work on the Premiere plugin as well.
Oh crap! Another good question came in. I got to ask this one.
Sure.
Robin asks, "What are some criteria to be aware of when searching for a display for color correction?" Well, Robin, spend a lot of money because they ain't cheap.
Yeah, but the money does unfortunately not directly correlate to quality.
Yeah, that's what I've heard too. So any advice to pick your monitor besides go to a color grading suite and see what they're using?
Yeah, either that or talk to a professional. The problem is you can't really trust the spec sheets for a lot of these monitors, so they'll claim to have 100,000 to 1 contrast ratio. So that must be better than.
So what do we trust besides you and those who actually make a living out of this?
Yes, well, even if it's not just someone who's measured it with a high-end probe and can tell you what it actually is, or something that professionals are already using. So even relatively inexpensive plasma monitors from Panasonic are quite widely used.
Yeah, I've actually seen that.
And yeah, then they're not so bad.
Some of these new cheap 4K monitors that are TVs out there. I think one of the color grading place down here in Hollywood is using one of those things. This is great.
Yeah, the big caveat with any LCD is that you can have viewing angle issues. So if you're setting up a room where you're going to have someone sitting next to you looking at the color, you want to be real careful about that because they'll be seeing a different color than you're seeing. So that actually is one of the key things to look for if you're going to have more than one person looking at a monitor is the viewing angle issues. And then the other thing is just making sure it's calibratable because I've yet to find a monitor that you can just open up the box on, set on your desk, and go to work on it. It has to be something that can be calibrated and has the controls to do that. So that would be the other key thing to look for.